Hi there, this is Ryan Chatterson, and during this session we're going to be talking about water quality in aquaponics. So to start off, why is it important to maintain optimum water quality standards? Seems like a pretty simple question, but there's some pretty detailed answers to that, okay? It provides the best life for the organism you're raising. That's number one, first and foremost. If we're going to farm fish, plants on a lesser extent, if you're going to do, but to the fish, you need to provide the best life possible for those fish. You need to provide optimum water quality standards, not minimum water quality standards, okay? If you're gonna take the step to raise something, especially for food, for slaughter, do it in as humane of way as possible. It's going to create a better end product, okay? If you create those optimum conditions, a good life for that organism, it's gonna taste better on the table. It's gonna have less off-flavoring that happens from stress. Others, high ammonia levels can lead to off-flavoring, a lot of things like that. Raise fish in a healthy environment, you're gonna get a great end product. Faster growth and maturation. If they're happy, they eat more. They stay happy, they eat more, and they grow faster. That is the key to growing fish in a reasonable amount of time for sale for food, or to any other market, I guess you could say. But let's just take tilapia, for example. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, oh, there's no way you can grow a tilapia to market size in 6 months. It takes us 2 years, or it takes us 1.5 years. Well, it takes you 1.5 years because maybe you aren't following all the standards here that allow these fish to grow to their optimum speed, okay? The velocities in the tanks, the percentage of food daily, monitoring the growth rates to make sure we increase feed enough to keep those fish growing as fast as possible. Having a correct biofilter, which is going to process that ammonia, give them a good, healthy environment, and encourage a stronger feeding response. So everything that we've talked about up to this point leads us to the best product possible at the most economic price. That's what design is. That's what we're doing, okay? More money in your pocket, food in your house. That's the takeaway here, okay? Whether you're doing this for a business or you're doing this for home production, you maintain optimum standards and you're gonna make more money, okay? You're gonna create more food in the end, and better quality food. That's the big takeaway from all this. Not just do it because someone said so. There's the takeaway, money in your pocket, all right? Don't design for the fish or plant's minimum requirements. That's what we just talked about. Minimum requirements produce minimal results, okay? We want to design smart, save money where you can, and invest money in the important pieces of equipment that will help you maintain those optimum water quality standards. So all the money that we're saving by building certain pieces of equipment or by making our own stands, doing some of the groundwork by ourselves, building our own greenhouses, etc., all that gives you extra money. Now what you don't want to do is start out with just enough money to build everything as cheaply as possible. All right? Because with that extra money, you want to use some of that to invest in the better pieces of equipment, the ball valves that turn easier, okay? The properly sized pipe and type of fittings that are gonna work out the best for the job at hand. You don't want to come at that with the mindset, oh my gosh, I'm spending so much money on these fittings or on certain pieces of equipment. You need to think about it as, I've already saved so much money, I'm spending this smartly, but I'm still saving money on the whole project because of everything that you're doing for yourself to bring the price down. So that's really what I would say, how you kind of need to reason with this. Some of the stuff you do have to spend a little bit more money on. I don't like buying a $60 bulkhead or a $50 ball valve. That's hard money to spend because it takes a lot to earn $50. On the other hand, this is something that's going to be for the life of your system, and because of that, spend the money on the important pieces of equipment. The fish crop and the plant crop may have similar requirements, or they can be vastly different requirements. It's important to decide what crops you intend to grow before you design the system based on generalized water quality requirements. Okay, so I've laid a lot of generalities out there, and those work great for home food production and things where every cent counts, every day of production counts. You know, that's what matters in a commercial sense. So you can generalize and, you know, just grow an array of crops at certain times of the year, you know, a lot of the other things. But it's very important, if you're doing this commercially, to decide what crops you're going to grow and what fish you're going to grow, and know that you're going to be able to sell them. Okay, you have to decide that. Know that you're going to be able to sell them. Know that selling price so that you can plug that into your business plan and make sure this is going to work in the first place. You do not want to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars, it's a lot of money, okay, into an operation just to find out 3 months after you open the door that it's not going to work, numbers aren't panning out, and you know, a year down the road you're still going to be losing money. Or to find out that you should have designed it differently because although this avenue is not working, if you would have designed it this avenue, it could have been a profitable company, okay? So these are really important things to think about. Decide those crops to grow. That comes in the business planning. It comes in getting out there and talking to people, and while you have your backyard system or your small trial system, and figuring out the market, figuring out what is going to make you money, okay? Water temperature is crucial. I've tried to put that in a lot of presentations in a lot of different areas, but that is one of the most overlooked factors when people build a commercial operation. They'll spend the money on a lot of equipment, but they do not spend the money on a chilling system, a heating system to keep that water temperature in that desirable range. And that's huge. Okay, this is where a decision needs to be made about whether a recirculating system or a decoupled system is right for your operation. So you've decided what crops you're going to grow, right? You've gone out, you've done your research, decided basil and salmon are what I want to grow, or I'm going to do tilapia and lettuce, or I'm going to do trout and tomatoes. Okay, whatever you decide, or, you know, a big mix of stuff. Right here, it will tell you, you know, by overlapping those requirements, whether you're going to have a recirculating system and fall within the requirements to allow you to do that, or whether you're going to need to decouple the system because the fish and the plant requirements fall far outside of each other. If the water quality requirements overlap favorably, then again, a recirculating aquaponic system can be chosen. If they don't, decouple the design and run the plant and fish components separately. Now here's a small water chart that we actually used for years back when I was at Aquatic Ecosystems, and it just lays out some general terms as far as different species and what their tolerances are, okay? And it gives you, here's trout, hybrid striped bass, tilapia, goldfish and koi, shrimp freshwater, shrimp saltwater, which you're probably not dealing with, minnows and shiners, which are your bait fish, and then tropical fish, so for sale in the aquarium trade, which by all means, this is something else you could get into. Smaller tropical fish have a high dollar resale value. So if, you know, research that, and that could be a profitable fish crop for your operation. On this axis, we've got temperature. So what they will tolerate, I'm sure they can go a little bit outside of these ranges, but these are really the midway ranges. So for tilapia, we see 75 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, tilapia will live down to 55, but this is really the general growing temperature range that you're gonna see for these fish. Dissolved oxygen, pH, alkalinity, carbon dioxide, so CO2, unionized ammonia levels, nitrite, hardness, chloride, and salinity. Okay, so it gives you a lot of the terms here that you're going to see for these different fish. And this allows you to overlap some of these with your plant varieties. So you see trout, pH, we could have 5.5 to 8. They take a pretty low pH. Well, guess what? That is great because our plants desire a lower pH. In fact, trout take a lower pH than anything else you see up here. They can do well in that low of a pH. That's a great thing. So that's very desirable trait. We can see the rest of them here pretty much lie between 6 and 8, and that's fine too. But we've got our alkalinity, we've got our different levels here, and it tells you, pretty much gives you an idea of how hardy that fish is. So those are really good just to have for a quick reference. The dissolved oxygen is something we need to think about, okay? We're going to talk about water quality for fish here, and then we're going to kind of move over to the plant side. So DO, dissolved oxygen, what is considered acceptable? Well, it varies with species, but greater than 3 parts per million, okay? That's really the lowest you're ever going to see for even low oxygen tolerating species like a tilapia. Why is it important to check often? Well, the fish are constantly growing as well as your feed amount and bacteria colonies. So the fish are growing, we're feeding more to the system, bacteria colonies are growing, they're consuming more oxygen during the process. All this means your oxygen levels are slowly raising throughout the grow out period. Charting dissolved oxygen levels can give you a good indication of when you might need more or less air in the system. Okay, so we do this with a dissolved oxygen meter. It's a handheld meter, or they have stationary meters for more money in larger operations that will give you continuous dissolved oxygen readings. But in a smaller operation, you can use a handheld meter and you measure dissolved oxygen levels daily and record those. So during your first grow out period, you will get a very good idea of the oxygen levels, how they change throughout the grow out period, and how you have to actually adjust the air if you're only providing the minimum amount of air the entire time. If you size off of the final harvest weight, like I've kind of suggested through this, well, you're gonna have no problem all the way up to the time of harvest because you size off that final weight. If you're trying to be a little bit more efficient, a little more stingy with the air, you can slowly meter up the air in the tanks that are getting bigger, and then as you harvest tanks, you can meter down the air there. So you can save a little bit and make it a little bit more efficient if you only provide the required air at the amount of time that they're growing, at the size that they're growing. So again, personally, I would size for maximum stocking density. Makes it a lot easier. You don't have to worry about it. But I would still chart the dissolved oxygen levels because it tells you if there's anything wrong. And again, when you feed, dissolved oxygen levels drop. Because they're spending a lot of energy to eat that food, and then you slowly see it start to climb after that. Well, it's good to know how much it's dropping during that feeding period. Maybe that would cause you to do more frequent feeding periods with less food in each one so that you don't drop the dissolved oxygen level to an undesirable level, and the fish will actually grow better. So these are things that a meter will tell you, and they answer a lot of questions that you might have, but you're never going to get the answer to unless you have a meter to tell you the answer. Okay, charting dissolved oxygen levels, we just talked about that. Biological oxygen demand, BOD. It can consume considerable amounts of oxygen because, again, this bacteria is growing, it's aerobic, and it's consuming and doing work. It's consuming ammonia, it's converting and doing life processes. That takes oxygen. A lot of the organic breakdown going in a plant trough is going to take oxygen. So there's things other than the fish that take oxygen, and we have to take those into account, but a dissolved oxygen meter will help us figure out what's going on. If we see, we'll talk about that later in the plant side. Okay, so for pH, what's considered acceptable? Well, again, I would reference back to specific species requirements for whatever fish that you're growing. And you, again, would do a little more research than just this course because we can't go over every single species of aquacultured fish. But once you pick your species, you know, get some literature on that fish from your state. If you can't find anything from me, I'll go ahead and email you some and figure out, you know, you get the general water quality requirements for that species. But what's considered acceptable? Some species are much more sensitive than others. It's so you want to look this up beforehand so you don't let it drop into the 5 range of pH, 5.5 to 6.0. Let it drop in there and then have all of a sudden your fish start to die off or something. Don't want that. High pH can cause unionized ammonia levels to rise, which can be detrimental to your fish population. So ammonia unionized to ionized ratio changes depending on the pH and temperature of the water. So at a higher pH, ammonia becomes more toxic, and that's not something we want. That's not something the fish want. Good indicator of how your biofilter is performing. So like we discussed before, the end product of a biofilter is it's converting that ammonia to nitrate, but it yields acid as a byproduct. So we should see pH falling coming out of the biofilter in a healthy biofilter. If the pH is rising coming out of that biofilter, then there's a problem, because we also have the main CO2 production going on in the biofilter, and guess what? That's going to lower your pH as well. So we've got a lot of entities lowering your pH. pH should always be lowering coming out of that unit. If it's raising or holding steady, there's a good chance you might be getting some sediment building up in that tank. We're not going to see a huge drop, but we're going to see a drop in pH. And if all of a sudden it's holding steady or rising, it's time to open up that sludge valve and drain out anything that's accumulated in the bottom of that tank. Alkalinity, all right? What is considered acceptable? I'd say 40 to 200 parts per million is considered acceptable for fish. Most aquaculturists would not like to see it below 100, but for some species, again, if you're on the lower ends of what's considered acceptable, 40 is on that low end. I always range between 40 and 60 parts per million using hydroxides and as buffers, because they don't add a lot of alkalinity back into the system, so we have lower overall alkalinity numbers. But what that allows me to do is actually control the pH a little more precisely, because we don't have a buffer in there halting the pH change up and down. There's no buffer in there, really, not as much, because again, it's a low alkalinity. So when we dose something, the pH has an immediate reaction, and we just dose it on a pH controller so that if it were to go a little higher than you want, it shuts the pump off and allows it to equalize before it starts dosing again. Why is it important to check periodically? Well, alkalinity is directly related to pH in that it tells you how well your water is going to stay buffered, okay? Like we just talked about, high alkalinity means you're not going to get big pH swings. You're going to get it to hold, you know, at 7.4, 7.3, up in the mid 7 range, and it's going to hold there constant. It's not going to slowly drift one way or another during the day, because as acids are created, more of the carbonate buffer source is dissolved into the water, and so it would lower our alkalinity as it dissolves that, instead of lowering the pH, okay? So it's really kind of easy to think. You've got acids and you've got bases. If you have a lot of base here and then you add some acid, it's going to stay constant. If you don't have much base there and you add acid, all of a sudden the pH is going to fall some. That's the best way I think I can explain it right now. Well, low alkalinity can slow or stop nitrification as the process consumes alkalinity and yields acid. So that's just what we talked about. During the biofilter process, to convert that ammonia, it's consuming alkalinity to create that acid and to turn it from ammonia into nitrite, then to nitrate. So that's just a byproduct of the reaction, is that it consumes alkalinity and yields acid. Unionized ammonia. What's considered acceptable? Well, as close to zero as possible with all species. Fish tolerances vary, so you'd have to look at a specific species tolerance for whatever you're growing, but they're generally as close to zero as possible. Now, why is it important to check periodically? Well, a high level can be an indication that something is wrong with your biofilter. It means it's not processing the ammonia that it should be. It could mean that your biofilter is undersized, that you didn't size it right to begin with, and it's not going to process the amount of ammonia you're generating daily. And it can also mean that you're feeding too much for the filtration to handle. You're just feeding too much, and you need to go back and look at your calculated feed amount. It might be a little different than what you're actually throwing in the tank every day. Depending on pH and temperature, high levels can be extremely harmful to your fish. And here's a chart to kind of show you that trend, okay? We've got pH on this vertical axis, and we've got temperature on the horizontal axis at the top, okay? And this is in Celsius. So we can see at 10 degrees Celsius and 6.0 pH, the percent of ionized ammonia is 0.02%. Of total ammonia, the percent that's unionized is 0.02, okay? That's not very much. But as we trend hotter and as we trend a higher pH, you can see those levels get larger and larger. And then we get down to something like 8.8 pH. At 8.8 and the same temperature, we're at 10.5% unionized ammonia instead of 0.02, just from a pH change, okay? So as temperature goes up and pH goes up, the percent of unionized ammonia goes up. And that's what's toxic to our fish and is going to kill them. Keep that in mind. If you've got a lot of ammonia in your system, you had something horrible happen, lower the pH slightly, not too far that your biofilter is not going to work, but into a range that it will make the percentage of unionized ammonia acceptable to your fish. Now we're going to talk about nitrite and what's considered acceptable. Well, we're back to as close to zero as possible. It's really something we don't want to see any nitrite in the system. There's always going to be probably a little residual nitrite in there because that's what's feeding those bacteria. It's constantly produced and it's constantly taken in from the bacteria, consumed and converted to nitrate. So it's always going to be there, but in very, very low numbers. Why is it important to check periodically? High levels can cause brown blood disease and lead to fish death. Okay, so this is very similar to a diver that gets the bends, that goes diving, he gets down too deep and he flies up to the surface, he gets nitrogen gas bubbles in his bloodstream. That's no good, okay? Nitrite bonds to hemoglobin to form methemoglobin. Iron is in its ferric state, Fe3+, instead of its ferrous state, Fe2+, like normal hemoglobin, okay? So it turns your blood from red to brown because of what is going on. The iron's in a different state, okay? So classic, if you have a fish kill from nitrite poisoning, you can cut their gills and they'll bleed brown. And that's how you can confirm it's brown blood disease and high nitrite poisoning. Okay, so it's important to check periodically, just like ammonia, so that we know our biofilter is working and we don't have any crazy mishaps. But that's not something we're testing for every day, every week. It might be a monthly test just to make sure we're doing all right, or a spot test in case we have something strange come up. Okay, now hardness, what's considered acceptable? We'd have to look back at the chart. This is just another small factor that we're going to keep an eye on. Why is it important to check periodically? Well, it's good to know our levels to make sure that the fish are going to develop properly. They need proper hardness levels for bone development, so that's good to keep an eye on. But again, this is maybe a monthly, bi-monthly test. Chloride, we'd have to see the chart to see what's considered acceptable, and same with salinity. So in a recirculating aquaponics system, we're not using salt or salinity to maintain that fish, and we really don't want a lot of salt in the system. So we have to, I personally don't use salts, and we want to try to maintain as low a salt level as possible so that when the water makes its way over to our plant area, it doesn't affect the plant growth. Okay, so in aquaculture, it's common to keep some salt in the water to stimulate a little slime coat on the fish, but in aquaponics, we really want to limit any kind of salt usage. And that's it for this session. Again, if you have any questions at all, please email me, ryan@collegeofaquaponics.com, and I will be sure to cover those questions in our weekly question and answer session and make sure you get all the information that you need. Thank you very much.